This is the Sony FX30, a proper cinema camera for under $2,000. Pretty amazing. What makes this a proper cinema camera versus every camera that has video recording? Well, there's actually a lot to it. Okay, of course it's got good specs, 4K 60, even 4K 120 with a crop. Of course it's got a very angle screen, a flippy screen that flips forward. 2 card slots, so you don't have to worry about a card failure. It has digital mic in, as well as like an available handle. That means you can use up to 2 proper XLR mics and have analog dials to control their levels. It has sensor stabilization, it has S-Log3, but it has something that people are really going to like if you're creating vertical content, if you frequently need to fit your camera into weird places. It is a built-in cage. That's right, tripod mounts on the sides and the top of the camera. Can I just tell you why 4K 60 is important on a camera like this? It's not because people are going to appreciate the higher frame rate or they're going to watch it on some big monitor where they could see the 4K resolution. It's for coverage. Look, I have hours until the embargo for this camera ends and I have to publish this video. I don't have time to go and pick up shots. And I did not show those mounting points for a long enough period of time. But you know what I can do is I can zoom in 200%, which will still be full HD, and I can slow it down 50%, which extends the footage long enough to cover my voiceover. 4K 60 is about covering mistakes, not about quality. Tripod mounts on both sides and the top of the camera. Now it does take 26 megapixel stills, but the stills are taking a backseat to the video capabilities, sort of the opposite of every other camera out there. And that really closely reflects the current trends in our world, right? On Instagram, everything is now video first and still second. So I think a camera like this makes a lot of sense. Now, it looks a lot like the FX3 from Sony. Yeah, it seems to have an identical body, but they cut the sensor size in half and they cut the price in half. Now, there are other, what they call Super 35 or APS-C cinema cameras out there like the Canon C70, but it costs 3 times as much. And it actually kind of does less in many ways. It doesn't have Sony's lineup of mirrorless lenses like the 11mm f1.8, a super wide angle lens designed for APS-C that still allows you to blur the background, still gives you good low light performance, and allows some cropping in for things like stabilization. Mounted on the camera here is my go-to APS-C lens for vlogging like this, a 15mm f1.4. Look at that aperture that can be clicked on or off. And a really cool lens, the 10-20G f4 power zoom that you can zoom in and out smoothly using a button here or a button on like your DJI gimbal or your Sony remote control. These give you capabilities that other APS-C cameras just don't, because it really is more about the lens than it is about the body. There's not really a direct competitor to this, but I'm gonna do my best. I'm going to compare it to the Nikon Z30. This is Nikon's creator camera. It is a flip screen, but no proper viewfinder. I'm going to compare it to my daily workhorse, what I'm recording on now, a Sony a7S III. And for all those creators who got a good sponsorship and they have a few bucks to spend, and they're thinking about upgrading from their smartphone, I'm gonna compare it against the most popular camera in the world, the iPhone, specifically my iPhone 14 Pro Max, to see what you get when you upgrade to a real camera. So let's start those tests. For a piece to camera test, I'm starting with the iPhone 14 Pro Max in cinematic mode at 4K 30. I'm using the rear wide angle 24mm camera and I'm composing the shot on my watch. Why would I compare a cinema camera to a smartphone? Because everybody starts on their smartphone now. So if you are buying a camera, you have to justify the difference between what you can get with your smartphone and that camera. Now, the iPhone costs almost as much as this Sony, but the fact of the matter is you need an iPhone anyway. This is how you consume content. This is probably how people edit content. It's certainly how you upload content to places like TikTok. So you don't get around having one of these. It's kind of a sunk cost. The Sony has to justify the difference in quality by providing significantly better result. This is the Sony FX30 in our piece to camera test, and I'm noticing a few really interesting differences. First, there is a red tally light, so I know for sure that it's recording, and if it shuts off, I think I would notice. The screen itself also has a nice bold red border, and I can see that Sony has changed the arrangement of some key things, like the audio levels now show in the upper left corner instead of overlaying the screen. So the screen itself is much cleaner. I'm going to move in and out, get really intimate, and see how it tracks autofocus on my eye. Each of these cameras is recording in 4K, but not all 4K is created equal. This sensor is a 6K sensor that is downsampling to 4K. It's also capable of shooting at 4K at 60 frames per second. Now our channel is all 60 frames per second. I prefer that smooth look. Now right now the sound you're hearing comes from the on-camera mic attached to the handle, and that's really novel because it moves the audio much closer to my face, and there is no bigger factor in audio quality than proximity of the mic. So let's switch to a standard on-camera shotgun mic and see how that sounds. Now this is the sound you get with an on-camera mic. And even though the handle only pushes it, I don't know, a foot closer, you can see there's a pretty big difference in audio quality, especially in a room that doesn't have professional soundproofing, because now the mic is hearing so much more of the echo volume relative to my own voice. As I'm turning this on and off, I really appreciate that Sony has made a camera that I can operate from the front. The record button is big and huge and easy to see. I have a second record button over here. The tally light is bright and obvious, and I can even adjust the zoom. Watch, even though this is a prime lens, I can still do a digital zoom up to 1.5 times because the sensor is oversampling. So it's staying a true 4K. It just crops in, basically turning all of your primes into at least a 50% zoom. This is recorded with the Nikon Z30, which costs less than half of the FX30, despite having the same number, 30. There are some significant disadvantages to this. First, the half price gets you the DX kit lens. That's their APS-C kit lens. So the background here isn't going to give me the same amount of background blur that I would get out of the FX30 with its available prime lenses. Nikon does not have any native mirrorless APS-C wide-angle primes like you would use for vlogging. Like the iPhone 14 cinematic mode, this is limited to 4K 30, so you're getting half the frame rate of the FX30 in 4K mode. The Z30 also doesn't support digital mics, and it has a single card slot, so if that card fails, you've lost all of your recordings, which has happened to me, and it's the reason I insist on using cameras with 2 card slots. Finally, this is the Sony a7S III, which has identical image quality to the Sony FX3, which is one step up in the cinema line. The big difference here is that this camera has a full frame sensor, and that gives it more light gathering capabilities and more background blur at a given f-stop.
Oh God, this again. We know, everybody knows. Let's just skip to the side-by-side. The full frame camera has more background separation. That's a good thing. The Nikon Z30 with its slow lens has almost none. What's surprising is the iPhone's bokeh actually looks really natural until you look at my face. And then if you look really closely, you can see the iPhone's bokeh blurs the hair unnaturally, whereas the other cameras do it much more naturally. That's the benefit of getting a real camera. Also, the iPhone makes me look like an Oompa Loompa and removes all the shadows that I've very carefully placed there by using a softbox. Otherwise, even on a 30-inch screen, they all look good.
Now let's talk about TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. This is short format vertical video. And some of you are like, oh no, this is a cinema camera. Twerking is not cinematography. Well, maybe Martin Scorsese isn't on TikTok, but Francesca Scorsese is. Look, I resisted vertical for a long time too, but guess what? They started paying, and if you want to sell stuff to people under 30, you pretty much need to figure it out. Now, the vast majority of vertical content creators are using a camera that looks like this, right? And that makes it really easy because this is how you hold it anyway. And if you were to put it on a tripod, you could slap on a Moment magnetic thing here, and look, horizontal, vertical, cannot get easier than that. The Nikon Z30 is a capable video camera, and if you want to go vertical, well, you could just put it on a ball head tripod and flip it like this, but that wouldn't work on most video tripods. And that's also not going to work on something like a gimbal, because The Z30 does not have vertical tripod mounts. So instead you mount the camera to an L bracket or a cage, but this is not an ideal situation because this adds bulk and it adds weight, especially on a gimbal or any handheld situation. That is not ideal. That makes your job more difficult. This is my vertical gimbal rig, and you'll see that I had to use an L bracket to get it attached to my A7S III because it does not have a built-in cage like the FX30 does. And if you watched my TikTok where I showed you how to take the doors off the A7S III, now maybe you understand why I needed to do that. It's not because I didn't know weather sealing was a thing. So let's take a look at the integrated cage on the FX30. You can see I've attached this tripod directly to the side of it. And at least with this specific tripod, I can still open up the door and retrieve the cards, though if I were using a bigger quick release plate, it would be blocked. So it's not perfect in that way. I wish they could put all the ports and stuff and the SD cards on the top and leave the sides, both of them available for mounting. Now I pretty much have to leave this side open in this scenario because for one, I need to use the flip screen, but also this is where the HDMI ports are, this is where the mic jack is, so I couldn't necessarily mount that to a tripod. This is probably more useful for mounting accessories. Let's move some of this clutter out of the way. So how does the FX30 function as a vertical camera? The results are honestly kind of mixed. It'll detect the vertical orientation and put that into the video file's metadata, so when you import it into a video editing app, you don't have to rotate it. That's good. And the screen is visible and the microphone attached to the side here does still work okay. But it has some real drawbacks in vertical format, like the user interface does not rotate vertically. And if you go into the menu systems, they don't rotate vertically either. But for vertical creators like me, follow me on TikTok, the biggest challenge to using a camera like this is indeed the workflow, because you have to transfer the files from the camera to your smartphone. And the smartphone app kind of sucks. Like it could transfer things via Wi-Fi, but it's frustrating and slow and kind of unreliable. And as a result, I end up pulling the video files off of a memory card. Sony, I need cloud sync for the files or something solid and reliable and fast to transfer things to my phone. For the next test, I've switched to the 11mm f1.8, a fast APS-C prime that doesn't exist for any other system like Canon or Nikon. And I've put it into the S-Log 3 picture profile so that I can capture more dynamic range. And this will allow me to walk around with a pretty stable setup and capture really bright highlights like this while my face is in shadow. So I'm going to walk through the yard a little bit and we can switch between different scenes and see how it handles this huge dynamic range and the exposure. Here we can get the sun right in the background and hopefully we can see some of the sky still while also being able to capture my face. Now, the 11mm seems really wide. In APS-C to full frame format, that puts me at about 16mm. But also I have active stabilization turned on, which crops in a little bit and helps to stabilize the footage. And this is allowing me to hand hold it without having to use a heavy gimbal. That means that the rig is lighter and I'm still getting a pretty stable shot. By contrast, here's the footage you get from the iPhone's cinematic mode. And you can see it's providing me some decent background blur. But let's move into the sun.
Let's move into the sun. Shut up and show the side by side. Look, the iPhone gets all washed out in the sun and it has crazy flaring. Slow it down 50% and the iPhone cinematic mode gets all jerky while the FX30 stays smooth.
It does do HLG, high dynamic range, as does the Sony FX30. By comparison, this is the iPhone's action mode. And here it doesn't have a rear facing screen and it doesn't work with the front facing camera. So I have to use my watch to compose the shot and then just kind of hold it and hope that it works out okay.
Wait, what? Don't do that. Okay, the iPhone's action mode actually worked really well. It was smoother than even the FX30, and it has the same video quality problems, but yeah, I'd use it for vlogging. And the on-camera mic actually sounds pretty good too.
It's work and post-processing. Now we're in my sad and dark basement to test low light performance. My shutter's at 1/60th. The ISO is 12,800 and I'm using the fastest lens, the 15mm f1.4. And I want to see how it handles autofocusing in this more challenging scenario and just how noisy everything is getting. You know how bright candles are?
Yeah, everyone's seen a candle for f***'s sake. What's important here is that I go out of focus for no particular reason as I ramble on and on. Sometimes it goes back to my face and then back to the background, and the screen is really too small to make this obvious.
The only way to understand how cameras with different size sensors are going to perform in low light is to use the crop factor. And that
Oh God, he's talking about crop factor again. Just skip to the next camera.
This is the Sony a7S III, again, the same sensor as the Sony FX3. So you can see that what I should be getting is better low light performance.
Yeah, it's cleaner. The autofocus is better. Next.
This is the Nikon Z30, and it probably looks worse, but it's not really the camera's fault. It's the lens's fault.
Oh, stop trying to please the Nikon fanboys. They're going to be mad either way. Nikon made a camera for creators and gave you no good lenses. Next.
This is the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and once again, I have to use my watch to compose the shot because I'm using the rear camera here. And honestly, it doesn't look really good.
Actually, it's not bad. It's cleaner than the Nikon, and it kept me in focus the entire time.
I still think it's worth testing because computational photography can...
Dude, shut up about the computational photography. We get it. Okay, you get what you pay for. The full frame camera did better in low light. The only surprise here is that the iPhone clearly outperformed the Nikon with its kit lens. Nikon needs to produce some faster APS-C lenses if they're gonna play in this ballpark.
I am really impressed with the FX30. It provides a really unique price point. And though it's APS-C and I'm kind of a full frame snob, the fact that Sony gave us good quality, fast, designed for APS-C mirrorless lenses mean that you can actually create full frame equivalent results, and I'm totally satisfied with that. Now, I've also been impressed with the Nikon Z30, but without those lenses, you're not going to be able to get the same results, but it is half the price, and that says something. And of course, I still love my Sony a7S III or the Sony FX3 if you want that built-in cage body. And full frame is kind of impossible to beat, but they are twice the price. But if you do have the budget, it might be worth upgrading. But that said, I've also really liked most of the results I got from my iPhone. I think the reasons I'd want to upgrade from my iPhone to a conventional camera at this point are, well, the nitpickiness of the real bokeh versus the fake bokeh. But honestly, without really squinting and looking for the flaws, I didn't notice it. The cinema mode is pretty good, but it doesn't do 4K 60 in cinema mode, which is what I like to film in. I also continue to hate the way it renders skin tones. Why does it make me look so flat and orange? The iPhone is just doing too much with the skin processing. Just back off and give me like natural human skin. There are a few competitors worth mentioning. There's the Canon C70, a cinema camera that costs 3 times as much. It adds a built-in ND filter and a few more things you can plug in and some nice features. It's a little more of a serious high-end cinema camera. But you're pretty much going to end up adapting APS-C DSLR lenses because Canon hasn't gotten around to making little RF mount mirrorless lenses for APS-C that can produce these types of results. There's also the Panasonic GH6, which is an amazing cinema camera that we would use for everything except for one problem: autofocus. The autofocus still does not work very well, and especially when we're filming ourselves, we really rely on that. So that's a must-have feature for us. There's also the Fujifilm X-H2S, which has all the features and a great selection of lenses, but it lacks any power zoom lenses, at least in this focal range of 10 to 20 f4 that creators like myself would want. It also doesn't have the autofocus capabilities of Sony. In the comments down below, let me know why you might want the FX30. What are you creating? You got a TikTok or a YouTube, or are you actually trying to make film? And subscribe to see more reviews like our full review of the iPhone 14 Pro camera that I would have finished if I didn't have this release coming up, as well as reviews of the Nikon Z30 and tutorials for everything. Bye.